a historic view, which comes largely from theoretical work, was that the brain's electrical activity is what's so expensive. Because in the same way I talked about the fact that when you put a lot of neurotransmitter in a vesicle, it costs you energy because there's a huge gradient, thousands of
Yeah.
molecules in a tiny volume. That same logic applies just across all membranes of the plasma membrane, that there's ion gradients. That's the
Yep.
basis of
Yep.
how all cells
Yeah.
communicate.
So I guess the idea would be because, I mean, the whole point of a neuron is they can fire an action potential that
Right.
requires these massive fluxes of sodium and potassium and so forth. And then because that creates such strong gradients, you need a lot of pumps to
Right.
to create those gradients.
Yeah. Now, so I would say that's largely been a theoretical estimate of how expensive the brain is. I would say that, it seems so appealing. And of course, I would say of the era, say 15 years ago, it was easy to write down estimates of like how expensive this might be. I have to say there are a bunch of unknowns because the number of ions that actually cross the membrane to create an action potential is not necessarily that high. And it depends on, we need to know more things than we know to have an accurate number. What those calculations tend to have ignored historically was anything else, because they didn't know how to do a calculation for the synapse. They knew how to do it for excitability. And so the historic view has been the reason the brain's so expensive is because of electrical activity. I would say all the evidence we have now is that the axons themselves are not that expensive to keep running with electrical activity. It ends up being the synapses being things that are probably the things we have to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there may be exceptions, of course, and the brain is a complex organ with lots of different cells, but the synapse had been ignored as an important part of this. So we know two things. One, it's a super sensitive part that really breaks far before the ability to fire an action potential if you cut off fuel supply.
Yeah,
and the other, the data we have now coming that's not published looks like, and actually some of it is published, that it wasn't so much the electrical activity, it really was all about the synapse and why it's so expensive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wanted to separate the two concepts of expense versus sensitivity.
Right. No, I think that's an important thing to drill home because, I mean, just to kind of riff on the analogy you made, but in a different way, if you were to cut my salary in half, I would make sure to keep paying my rent. I would cut lots of other stuff, but just because those things are getting cut, that doesn't make them more important. It actually makes they're less important. That's why I'm cutting them. Yeah. So, but synapses are expensive, and there's a lot of them, no doubt about it. I want to talk a little bit about energy sources in the brain. I actually don't know so much about this myself, so I have a lot of. I don't actually even know what the known unknowns and unknown unknowns are here, but the mitochondria can make ATP, say, from either fatty acids or from sugar, from glucose. And I've covered those kinds of topics in different ways on the podcasts on previous podcasts, but not in the context of synapse function specifically. Well, I want to start out very basic here. Is the brain, and especially in synapses, is it mostly using glucose as a fuel source? Is it using fatty acids at all? Has our picture of that started to change over time? What can you tell us about preferred fuel in the brain?
Right. So the dogma has always been that the brain largely runs on glucose. I mean, in some simple ways, it's not that glucose isn't super important, but just an example of what you learn either as preparing to go to medical school or in medical school, that it's very important to try and keep blood plasma glucose levels relatively stable. And the reason it's always given is because the brain is so hungry for glucose.
Yeah.
So you don't, and in reality, so an example I always like to give in seminars, if the sensitivity of the brain, if I gave you a shot of insulin, and I could cause your plasma level glucose to drop by just a factor of 2 for the average human, down below, let's say I crossed the 50 mgs per deciliter threshold, right? Yep. So that's about 2.8 millimolar. Most humans would begin to manifest neurological symptoms.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's within a small number of minutes.
Yeah, and that's a big drop.
It's a big drop. But you say, well, it's not much of a safety factor. It's just a factor of 2.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So it is a big drop, and of course, that's unusual. I could force it to happen by giving you insulin.
Right.
And in most healthy people, you'll never get that kind of a drop. But the reason you won't is because you have a liver that will make glucose.
Right.
And so that's we've been endowed with organs to make sure it's kept as constant as possible given other constraints, right? So that is part of why the thinking about the brain is an obligate user of glucose. Now the question is, are there other uses? Now, one thing we strongly suspect as the field, and there's good data on this, is there is another source that we know this from therapeutics, which is for children that suffer from, particular children that suffer from intractable epilepsy. Right, so this we call intractable is they're drug resistant, that they're nothing has seemed to helping them. The last last resort here is to go to a severe ketogenic diet.
Yep.
And that's quite effective in something like 40% of those intractable cases. Those children really benefit from a severe ketogenic diet. So that, of course, is under a severe ketogenic diet, you generate a lot of ketones, usually in the liver. And the thought is that those are getting the brain to be metabolized. And for some reason, there's now some bias, presumably, that's writing the imbalance of electrical inhibitory activity. Still not understood.
Yeah, so still not understood. So ketosis is effective for many forms of epilepsy like that. Sort of implicit in that whole thinking there is, okay, if you're shifting the bias towards ketones when you do a severe ketogenic diet for that particular therapeutic application, that would imply that under normal conditions for most people, maybe the brain is biased quite heavily towards glucose rather than ketones.